Davis's assessment is backed up by a recently released report from Afghanistan's NGO safety officer. The report warns NGO employees in Afghanistan not to take seriously the message of advances in security coming from the Pentagon. Mr. Speaker, I ask that this page from the Afghanistan NGO safety officer quarterly data report be inserted into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. The report reads, and I quote, "We find their suggestion that the insurgency is waning to be a dangerous fiction that should be given no consideration in NGO risk assessment for the coming year." A dangerous political fiction. I repeat, a dangerous political fiction. That is how this organization, dedicated to ensure the safety of NGO employees in Afghanistan, characterizes the rosy reports of steady progress in Afghanistan. Mr. Speaker, if we're going to ask our brave men and women in uniform to continue to risk their lives in Afghanistan, the least we can do is be frank and honest about how we are doing in Afghanistan. Our soldiers deserve to know the truth, and the American people deserve to know the truth after spending the past decade fighting wars. The war in Afghanistan has already taken the lives of almost 1,900 soldiers and drained our treasury of over $500 billion in direct costs. Those costs will only go up as we spend trillions of dollars on long-term care for our veterans, which we must do. We are set to spend an additional $88 billion in Afghanistan over the next year, while domestic cuts in education, health care, roads, bridges, and other essential priorities are sacrificed. Again, I repeat, it is time to bring our troops home from Afghanistan, not in 2014, not next year, but right now. Let me conclude by saying that as the daughter of a 25-year Army officer who served in 2 wars, I salute our troops and I honor our troops. Our servicemen and women have performed with incredible courage and commitment in Afghanistan, but they have been put in harm's way, and they have performed valiantly. It's time to bring them home. Thank you, and I yield the balance of my time.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Dold, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, I rise to pay tribute to American men and women in uniform, but specifically to an era in the Vietnam conflict that I think did not get as much thanks as it deserves. On February 11, 1965, flying off of the USS Coral Sea, Lieutenant Commander Robert Harper Shoemaker, flying an F-8 Crusader, was shot down over North Vietnam. His parachute deployed about 35 feet before he hit the ground. His back was broken upon impact. He was immediately captured and paraded through the streets. They took him to what became known at that time as the Wa Lo prison. This was going to be the main facility that would house POWs over the next several years. This prison was then dubbed by Commander Shoemaker as what we know it today as the Hanoi Hilton. This was an area that a number of POWs were tortured on a regular basis. Lieutenant Commander Shoemaker was the second American pilot shot down. At that point in time, it was somewhat of a blessing because the news media actually got pictures and was able to send word back to his family that he was indeed alive. That same fate would not be given to many other POWs, which is why the POWs spent time each and every day memorizing the names, the ranks of all the other 591 POWs that would go through the halls of the Hanoi Hilton. The Hanoi Hilton wasn't the only prison, however. 11 members of the United States military were actually taken out of the Wa Lo prison and brought over to what became known as Alcatraz. This became known as the Alcatraz 11. These were considered by the North Vietnamese to be the 11 greatest threats to camp security. We had men like Jeremiah Denton, who was a senator from Alabama, Jim Stockdale, who was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, George Coker, Ron Stortz, and I'm pleased to say a member of this body, Sam Johnson. In Alcatraz, these men spent literally years in solitary confinement in a 3-by-9-foot box with a single light bulb, which was kept on all the time. They were tortured on a regular basis if they were caught communicating. Lieutenant Commander Shoemaker was actually known amongst his peers as the great communicator. They devised a tap code earlier. The tap code, which would become now famous for those going through POW training, survival training. There was a 5-by-5 box, starting in the top row, A, B, C, D, E. They cut out K so they could have an even 5-by-5 box. They would communicate unbelievable volumes of knowledge. Commander Shoemaker actually taught French through the walls to Sam Johnson. In that solitary confinement, again, if they were caught communicating, they were tortured, so there was a reluctance to communicate. But that's how they kept themselves alive. That's how they exercised the one most important muscle out there, and that was their brain. Just a couple days ago, Mr. Speaker, marked the 39th anniversary of their release. February 12, 1973. So although we were not here in this body, we were at home, I felt it appropriate to come up and talk about the anniversary. Lieutenant Commander Shoemaker holds a near and dear place in my heart. He happens to be my uncle. And when my wife and I had our first child, we decided to name her Harper after him. This is an example of the bravery that goes on each and every day for our men and women in uniform. Not a day goes by that I don't thank the good Lord for the men and women that are protecting our nation each and every day. That I don't look at the picture of my uncle upon his capture and say, it's never going to be that bad. The stories are remarkable, and they continue to come in and day out because they don't like to talk about them. This was a unique group of individuals that actually had the American public was in support of. The Vietnam conflict wasn't very supportive, but everybody in America was supportive of the POWs that were putting their lives on the line. They would resist time and again from giving up information, and yet the North Vietnamese would continue to bring them in to try to torture them for additional information. Mr. Speaker, we are blessed to have countless American heroes amongst us, but I am proudest of my Uncle Bob Shoemaker. With that, I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington, Mr. McDermott, for 5 minutes.
Without objection. Mr. Speaker, this country has many faces of bravery. And today I want to recognize the courageous patriotism of active duty Army officer Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, who recently returned from a second tour in Afghanistan. He traveled thousands of miles throughout the country patrolling with American troops in 8 provinces and spoke to hundreds of Afghan and American security officers and civilians about conditions on the ground. Convinced that senior leaders of this war, both uniformed and civilian, have intentionally and consistently misled the American people about the conditions in Afghanistan, Davis wrote an 84-page report challenging the military's assertion that the war in Afghanistan has been a success. This report, which I read, was written at great risk to Lieutenant Colonel Davis's military career and personal life, and it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the war in Afghanistan and the decision-making that has led us to our current situation. Davis reports, quote, Senior-ranking U.S. military leaders have so distorted the truth when communicating with the U.S. Congress and American people in regards to conditions on the ground in Afghanistan that the truth has become unrecognizable. I strongly encourage every member of Congress to read this report as soon as possible. It's like the Pentagon Papers in its power. After reading it, you will find it impossible not to heed Davis' advice to hold public congressional hearings on the state of the Afghan war. More than 5,500 Americans were killed or wounded in Afghanistan in 2011 alone. How many more, he says, must die in support of a mission that is not succeeding? That's his question. Each and every one of us ought to ask himself or herself this difficult question. Even our intelligence agencies are skeptical about the Afghan war and if it's salvageable and our objectives realistic. Last month, a national intelligence estimate given to President Obama painted a bleak picture about our efforts in Afghanistan. At current levels of foreign assistance by the U.S. and Europe, which will be hard to sustain under the budgetary pressures, the NIE does not forecast rapid improvements in Afghan security forces or governance or the removal of the Taliban. I fear that we have forgotten the difference between respect for our military leaders and unquestioning deference to them. Questioning the war's strategy and objectives and consequences all too often discredits one's patriotism and impugns one's motive. Yet that unflinching assessment is precisely what the Lieutenant Colonel implores us to do. After 10 years in Afghanistan, what is the wisest course for us now? Sadly, we cannot even begin to answer that question because rampant overclassification of information has made it nearly impossible for the Congress to fully oversee, evaluate, and perhaps recast our war efforts. Recently declassified information about the Afghan war exposed brutal realities that have been withheld from the public. American troops incidentally and accidentally killing Afghan civilians, widespread corruption in the U.S.-backed Karzai government, and revelations about Pakistan's assistance to Afghan insurgents, to name just a few. Not every American has traveled 9,000 miles and witnessed what Lieutenant Colonel Davis has seen, heard, and understand. But we can, in this body, and must begin to investigate the charges of deception and dishonesty in his report. For our democracy to work, congressional officials and the public must have access to this type of information. The American public, which bears the extraordinary cost of this war, both in money and in pain, deserves to know the truth. The ancient Greek playwright Aeschylus cautioned, quote, "In war, truth is the first casualty." It is time to reclaim the truth of our war in Afghanistan by having congressional hearings. They should begin now. Some of us believe we ought to bring the troops home more quickly than the President, but we have to have hearings so that the American public will understand why it is this action should be taken. I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Request unanimous consent to address the House for 5 minutes.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to talk about the life and the work of Danny Thomas and the St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, which is located in Memphis, Tennessee. This year marks the 50th anniversary of St. Jude's Hospital and what would have been the 100th birthday of Danny Thomas. Commemorative postage stamps are one of the most visible and enduring ways that our nation honors organizations and people, and today the United States Postal Service will be celebrating the life and work of Danny Thomas with a commemorative stamp in my district, Memphis, Tennessee, at the St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. Danny Thomas was born on January 6, 1912 in Deerfield, Michigan. And after saving enough money, he moved to Detroit to take up a show business career. One of his first jobs was a radio show called The Happy Hour Club, and that's where he met his wife, Rosemarie Mantell. He met her on the show, he escorted her home, and for 3 years on a streetcar, they traveled together. Finally, he proposed. And they were married in 1936 and had 3 children, which the world pretty much knows, Marlo, Tony, and Terry. When Rosemarie was about to give birth to their first child, Marlo, Danny Thomas was torn between his dedication to work and his responsibilities to his wife and his newborn daughter. Desperately, he sought relief in prayer. He knelt before the statue of St. Jude, the patron saint of hopeless causes, and begged for a sign. Should he or should he not remain in show business? He promised that if St. Jude showed him the way, he would erect a shrine in his honor. Danny went on to become one of the best-loved entertainers of his era, starring in many TV shows and movies. From 53 to 64, he received 5 Emmy nominations for a starring role in Make Room for Daddy, winning Best Actor starring in a regular series in 53 and 54. The show also received an Emmy for Best New Situation Comedy in 53 and Best Situation Comedy in 54, and he produced comedy programs, The Dick Van Dyke Show, The Andy Griffith Show, The Real McCoys, and The Mod Squad. But he never forgot his promise to build a shrine to St. Jude. He had conversations with his close friend, mentor, a native of Tennessee, the Archbishop of Chicago, Cardinal Samuel Stritch. Cardinal Stritch was the cardinal in Toledo when Danny Thomas was in church, and they became close. And Cardinal Stritch, who served time in Memphis at St. Patrick's Church after he was in Nashville, which was his home, he told Danny that the shrine to St. Jude should be a hospital where children should be cared for regardless of race, religion, or ability to pay. And he told him that hospital should be in Memphis, Tennessee. Cardinal Stritch was a great man for many, many reasons, but this was one of them, the creation of St. Jude Children's Research Hospital with Danny Thomas. The hospital located in Memphis is one of the world's premier centers for research and treatment of pediatric cancer and other catastrophic children's diseases. It's the first and only pediatric cancer center to be designated as a comprehensive cancer center by the National Cancer Institute. Children throughout the United States and around the world come to Memphis in the doors of St. Jude for treatment. Thousands more have benefited from its research, which is shared freely with the world global community. No child is denied treatment because of ability to pay. The hospital has developed procedures that have pushed the survival rate for childhood cancers from less than 20% when the hospital opened to 80% today. It ranks as the #1 children's cancer hospital in the United States by U.S. News and World Report. The first completely integrated hospital in the South, a condition demanded by both Danny Thomas and Cardinal Stritch. Black doctors treated white patients, and white and black patients were together in the same rooms. As one of Memphis's largest employers, St. Jude has more than 36 employees, supported by a full-time fundraising staff of almost 900 at ALSAC, which is the American Lebanese Syrian Associated Charities. The Shadiak family has a great history in running that charity. ALSAC St. Jude, the fundraising organization of St. Jude, is the 3rd largest health care charity in America and raises money solely to support St. Jude. Danny Thomas was presented with a Congressional Gold Medal in 1983 by President Reagan in recognition of his work with St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. He died in 1991 at the age of 79. His great accomplishments and altruism make him an American hero worthy of the honor of a commemorative stamp imports. His life perfectly illustrates how the American dream can be within the reach of anyone, even an immigrant son of Lebanese parents with a humble upbringing. Mr. Thomas was an extremely compassionate man who certainly deserves nationwide recognition for his dedication to St. Jude and the children that the hospital has helped over these 50 years. To this day, Danny Thomas is still a part of every child's experience at St. Jude. Children rub the nose of Danny's statue for good luck prior to every treatment, sure proof that he will always be a source of hope and inspiration. I was pleased to support this effort by leading a letter to Postmaster General Patrick Donahue, and I commend the United States Postal Service for selecting Danny Thomas. I urge everyone to contribute and to visit the St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. I congratulate St. Jude and the family of Danny Thomas for all they do for children in the world. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield the balance of my time.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Ellison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, President Obama's decision to end combat operations in Afghanistan next year is welcome news. I commend President Obama for making this decision. But we should bring our troops home even sooner than that. The American people are tired of this war in Afghanistan. Large majorities of them want a safe and orderly withdrawal from Afghanistan as soon as possible. A decade of war has ravaged military families, our nation's treasury, and our standing in the world. I commend President Obama for ending the war in Iraq as well. I commend him for trying to end the war in Afghanistan. The courageous truth-telling of Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis should give us pause. His report and the failure to establish peace in Afghanistan after 10 years of war should remind us that we need a political solution, not a military one. We have ended the war in Iraq. This is a good thing. We are slowly ending the war in Afghanistan. This is also welcome news. But I suggest to you, Mr. Speaker, that it would be unwise for the United States to enter into a new war, just as we're ending two others. But if you listen to the rhetoric around Washington and the nation, Mr. Speaker, it is literally impossible to not hear the drumbeat of war with Iran. But the rhetoric in Washington about the military strike against Iran leads me to think that we may be sliding into a new war yet. I'd like to be perfectly clear, because whenever you speak against the war, your patriotism is challenged, your courage is challenged, until they find out that you were right. So let me be clear. I strongly oppose nuclear proliferation, and that includes Iran. I have supported sanctions against Iran to help prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. Iran's repression of human rights and support for terrorist groups is appalling. But the heated rhetoric we hear around our city and the events on the world stage are deeply troubling, Mr. Speaker. News headlines read, "The coming attack on Iran." Pundits discuss the possibility with shocking casualness, and I am alarmed by this. America, we have seen this movie before, and Mr. Speaker, it doesn't end well. 2 months after leaving Iraq, we have already forgotten the consequences of war, it appears. If you need a reminder, talk to a veteran or a veteran's widow. Mr. Speaker, our military leaders are cautioning against a strike on Iran. Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta said the United States, quote, could possibly be the target of retaliation from Iran, sinking our ships, striking our military bases, unquote. He said, quote, that would not only involve many lives, but I think would consume the Middle East in a confrontation and a conflict that we would regret, unquote. Let me repeat, a conflict that we would regret. Mr. Speaker, I wish the United States never entered Iraq. And before we entered it, the world, not just Americans, but the world said, don't do it. Some people led us to war anyway. And haven't we all regretted, after no weapons of mass destruction, no linkage between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden, none of these things that were recommended have come to pass, yet we've lost literally thousands of American lives and perhaps $1 trillion. Israeli intelligence officials have equally dire predictions about a military strike against Iran. Former Israeli Mossad chief Dara Dagan said that attacking Iran, quote, would mean regional war, and in that case, you would have given Iran the best possible reason to continue the nuclear program, unquote. There is serious concern that a military strike in Iran would hasten Iran's development of a nuclear weapon, not slow it down. A strike would only delay, not end, development. Speaking about what would happen after a military strike, retired General Anthony Zinni said, quote, if you follow this all the way down, eventually I'm putting boots on the ground somewhere, unquote. America cannot afford another war. We just got out of Iraq. We're getting out of Afghanistan, and diplomacy is what is called for to avoid another war with Iran in another decade. Mr. Speaker, thank you for the time. I yield back the balance.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Carnahan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A few weeks ago, I proposed a simple challenge to my constituents back home in St. Louis. I said, tell me your ideas for creating more jobs and economic opportunity in 2012, and I'll compile them. And not only take them back to Washington, but work to turn their ideas into action. I want to thank the over 600 Missourians I heard from, each offering many of their own common-sense solutions to help our economy continue to grow. I want to share their message on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives today. Their message was a clear consensus that we need to invest in our infrastructure, to make things here in the U.S., bring manufacturing jobs back from overseas, educate and train our workforce for the 21st century opportunities, and work together for the good of the country instead of pulling our country apart at the seams. My constituents in St. Louis are deeply concerned that our communities will be left behind in this new global economy if we don't act now, right now, without delay. As Joseph C. expressed best, quote, Missouri is a great state, but I'm afraid it will be left behind and manufacturing jobs will go elsewhere. Chris K. from St. Louis sent me an email saying, quote, what would help my personal economic situation and many others would be a greater investment in our nation's infrastructure. Joseph P. from St. Louis commented that, quote, investing in our infrastructure and educational systems will not only create jobs, but it will also result in long-term economic benefits for the entire country. Karen M. said, quote, we need to realize how important good carpenters, plumbers, electricians, bricklayers, secretaries, and caregivers are in the long scheme of things. We need to encourage and applaud these jobs. Kevin N. put it, quote, we need to invest in infrastructure for communications and transportation because public infrastructure is the greatest catalyst for economic development. To create jobs, Diane M. said, she has, quote, long thought that unions and small businesses that require special skills should provide apprentice programs to students, which would give hope and possibility through real skills to thousands of students who would not be exposed to these trades otherwise. And Christine A. echoed this sentiment by saying, quote, I believe it could be helpful to increase job training opportunities in our high schools. We need to pull together to create economic opportunities across this country and for the good of the country. Marilyn B. wrote to me personally. She said, quote, personally, I'm really frustrated that both sides of the aisle are not willing to work together for the good of all. As a member of Congress, I pledged to work with my colleagues to see that these great ideas from America's heartland are developed further. By working together and reaching across the aisle, I'm confident we can grow jobs and economic opportunity across this country. I look forward to using these common sense ideas to build a blueprint for putting our economy back on track, to turn these great ideas into action. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the chair declares the House in recess until noon today.
And the House will come back briefly at noon, returning later about 3 p.m. Eastern to continue work on amendments to an offshore oil and gas drilling bill, one of 3 parts of the